Teal dear. Actually, for once, because I'm going to be reading something to you rather than you reading it. Here's a video of me reading a comment I slightly autistically saved as a text file that I left on a video made by BASSFzz that YouTube removed twice because my main account on that godforsaken platform is unusable, because broadcast yourself TM from the company that gave its own CEO a free speech award. I just thought there was some interesting stuff in that comment that could do with getting a wider audience, because some of it relates to modern rhetoric and claims being made with regards to sensitive topics, such as leftoids attempting to transition children, and other such degeneracy that needs to be combated with great vigour. Hopefully you will find this interesting and will go watch the rather good video from BASSFzz that was inspired by a terrible conversation he had with Hunter Avalon. The reading. Hunter is a grade A cunt in his attitude. The unbearable smugness of any time you say something, "That's a myth, you're spreading myths, you're making me feel unsafe, you're coping because you're wrong, shh, stop talking, be quiet." It's such a condescending attitude to have, and a great way to make sure people never agree with you. If you ever wanted to demonstrate how he is like Vorsh, despite his objections to such a comparison, a few minutes of this attitude is all you need. Lefty debate bros have no interest in topics of discussion. They just want to assert dominance and be seen to win by their clapping seal audience for upvotes and money. Talking to people like him is ultimately a waste of time. Honest conversation with such a person is impossible. For the record, Hunter's "I just proved you wrong with evidence, logic and reason," re trans people's well-being as a result of becoming trans power move is very questionable. Firstly, the study he claims to be using is a literature review, not a study. Literature reviews are not studies. Definitionally, he's just wrong there. Secondly, the methodology is just bad. Basically, they just looked at any studies regarding any treatment for trans people being used. This can include even such basic things as affirmation. So if a trans person goes to a doctor and says, "I'm trans," and the doctor says, "Okay," that's counted in this review. The methodology mentions that there is no comparison design and asserts that it is not needed. So you're just looking at anything and everything. The annoying thing about this is that comparison designs can help weed out things, such as survivorship bias. For example, if a study has 100 people, they all get a treatment. 50% of them drop out. This happens all the time in studies. People just vanish, get bored, life change, can't be asked, etc. Now you've only got 50 people. Of that 50 people, 90% of them say they are happy with the treatment. A literature review of this study could easily just state 90% of the people who got this treatment were happy. Of course, let's say something really bad happened, and the reason for the 50% dropout was the development of some major adverse effect that meant people simply stopped going back to the experiment because they didn't trust the researchers anymore. Say they got something like chronic sores all over their bodies, constant migraines, boils, chronic vomiting, can't sleep, whatever, major health concerns, and they just stop going back. They just drop off the face of the earth for the sake of the study. A literature review could very easily remove that entire context by only focusing on those who fully completed the study treatment. I find it funny the constant assertion that your argument is all feels from Hunter and his chat to be hilarious, when that source of his says, quote, "Assessment of transgender individuals' mental or social well-being, such as successful functioning mental status, quality of life or relationship satisfaction," end quote. Literally, feels were measured, and if anyone claims they improved, job's a good 'un. This goes even further here, quote, "We eliminated studies, for instance, that did not assess the outcomes of gender transition, that investigated minors instead of adults, and that evaluated physical rather than mental health outcomes, because we did not want to conflate assessments of specific surgical techniques, for example with the broader question of whether gender transition improves well-being," end quote. They're also not looking at children who transition. I wonder if the rate of detransitioning/trans regret at/post-puberty has anything to do with that. They did not measure physical health outcomes, only mental health outcomes. Again, very interesting. Why ignore physical health? These sorts of bizarre criteria caused them to cut their sample of 589 studies down to 56. That hardly seems like a complete review of all the scholarly literature on the subject, as Hunter is attempting to paint it. But Hunter cannot read or understand these studies, like most of his ilk. He just sees "studies show" and points at it while pulling a soy face and declaring everyone else is wrong. It shows what he wants to see, and that's all that's needed. That's before we talk about the political minefield that is research into anything trans, if it might show something less than 100% positive. The cuntery continues with his "puberty blockers are reversible," which he backtracks to "mostly reversible." I'd imagine he'd call this applying nuance, but anytime anyone else does it, he screeches backtracking, so I might as well hold him to the same standard. It's also not true. Several studies have raised concern regarding bone density changes and permanent changes in height as a result. This is just an easy off-the-top-of-the-head thing to reference. The easy way to think of this is that when you're growing, your bones are open at the end. They're not actually open, but for the sake of the simplicity of the explanation, and the shaft of the bone gets longer over time. At some point, your body releases hormones that close the end of the bone, and it cannot grow past that point. If puberty blockers prevent or limit growth during that open time, you will necessarily have stunted growth. How important this is can be debated, of course, but if you're a boy who thinks he's a girl, changes his mind later and is now stuck at 5'6" because of bone density and growth problems, when you may have reached 5'9" to 5'11", that's a pretty significant impact on your life. It may impact your career path or recreation in the form of sport activities. It will definitely affect your romantic future. But remember the previous study Hunter cited? We don't care about non-adults and physical health in transitioning. I guess none of those facts matter. None of those people matter. The major problem with the puberty blocker conversation is it's novel. Puberty suppression is not a widespread treatment. Historically, it was mostly reserved for so-called precocious puberty, early onset to the point where it would cause developmental or social problems/distress, such as puberty starting at the age of 6 or something. The view with this was to allow puberty to resume as normal at a more appropriate age. What we're seeing now is very different and is a growing trend. More trans youth equals more pre-puberty treatments equals more suppression cases. We simply lack a large enough pool of historical data to draw upon to make too many solid statements. This is why it's so controversial now. The research is still ongoing. We find things for and against all the time. The more cases that come up though, and we're increasingly finding that there are irreversible changes caused by puberty suppression, and that there are increasingly, seemingly, more harms than benefits. Tie this to research showing a number of trans kids grow out of it when they hit puberty, something to the order of around 80%, it isn't anywhere near as easy as Hunter makes out. You also then get the really dumb shit he says, like calling pushing back against people claiming they're trans is conversion therapy, which is bad and shouldn't be done. Even though from a scientific and therapeutic approach from the point of view of a healthcare provider, you must question, also known as pushing back against someone because you need to accurately assess whether or not their self-diagnosis is accurate or not. Then later he points to people who go to gender clinics and aren't accepted because their self-diagnosis was deemed to be not correct and alternative treatments were provided. So on one hand, he calls questioning self-diagnosis bad and is conversion therapy and you're a transphobic bigot trying to kill people, but then he flip-flops to questioning self-diagnosis is good, it isn't conversion therapy, and it's a standard part of gender/sex conversion/reassignment. All this with his typical, get wrecked and dunked on conservatard attitude, without even realizing the blatant doublethink he just displayed. All in all, this conversation is fairly standard when dealing with a leftoid debate bro. No reliable facts or figures, all feels and saying whatever needs to be said in a moment to be seen to win by his retarded clapping seal audience, even if it outwardly contradicts a position stated moments before. And this is all for the sake of making money and getting clicks with no underlying understanding of the topic, or even a solid foundational philosophical position from which to draw. And here endeth the reading. I hope there was at least something interesting in it for you. Mostly I hope to demonstrate the choosiness, the cherry-pickingness, how selective a lot of this so-called pro-trans research is, cutting your scope of reading material down to around 10% of the total literature you could find is not a complete review of the scholarly literature. Unfortunately, leftoids like to paint their opinions as being these unassailable things backed up by all the studies and all the experts. These claims of some sort of expert consensus is almost always wrong as well. Usually, if so-called experts are directly polled, you find much greater disagreement than a leftist will ever admit to. The mythical agreement and consensus of the experts, their literature, and the science TM is almost always a result of simple cherry-picking and refusing to ever read anything outside of a list of pre-approved talking points and references. This is why you frequently find so many of them citing the same and often long since debunked studies. It's not about truth or science, it's only orthodoxy and repeated mantras.